Israel again orders Palestinians to move in Gaza. That's forcing the UN to relocate its base for aid operations, causing huge disruption. Palestinians are already facing malnutrition and disease while trying to survive Israel's attacks. So how can this situation go on? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. The amount of aid getting into Gaza has plummeted to some of the lowest levels of the war, says the United Nations. Getting supplies in for use in the Strip isn't a problem as long as it's weapons for the Israeli military. $20 billion more approved by the US last week. But getting food and medicine to the people there is a different story. The US effort to build a pier to land supplies in the Strip was trumpeted in a speech by President Joe Biden, but was a complete failure and was scrapped after a few weeks. Hospitals, medical facilities, water treatment and sanitation systems have been systematically destroyed by Israel with its Western weapons. Aid convoys that did manage to get in have been attacked too. Gaza is in ruins, disease is rife, its people battling to survive in an entirely man-made catastrophe. So how can this be allowed to continue in full view of the world? We'll be discussing all this with our panel of guests shortly. But first, this report from Wilson Dysart.
Israel is again forcing Palestinians to move. Thousands are fleeing after the Israeli army issued forced evacuation orders in Deir Balah, near the UN's main operations center in central Gaza. They're carrying whatever they can, under constant threat of death from the sky or a sniper's bullet.
A warning came to evacuate the hospital. We are still undergoing treatment and need painkillers. Where do we go? Where do we get treatment now?
The United Nations says its operations have been disrupted by Israel's latest demands.
We don't know where we are going. We don't have money, food or drink. We don't have anything. We have children. Where should we go?
The UN had already moved its operations base from Rafah and says it will now try to re-establish an aid center in Khan Yunis to treat wounded people who keep arriving under Israel's continuous attacks. Israel severely restricts the entry of food and medicine into Gaza. With most of the health system and sanitation infrastructure destroyed by Israeli bombing, disease is rampant and cases of polio are increasing. The policy is no accident. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant laid out Israel's plans for a complete siege of Gaza after the October 7th attacks.
I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly.
The reality for the people of Gaza of months of war is a daily battle to survive, to find food and water, and avoid death by disease or at the hands of Israel's military. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
The UN's Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees has faced numerous attacks on its facilities and operations. More than 200 of its staff have been killed since October. Sam Rose is their Director of Planning and he joins us from Rafah. Sam, let me first read you a quote from the UN Secretary-General about Israel's latest moves. The spokesperson says, "These evacuation orders make our work nearly impossible." That spokesperson is in New York. You're there in Rafah. Explain to us exactly why this is making your work so hard.
Yeah, James, thanks for having me on. I mean, everything about everything that we do in Gaza right now is difficult. We had the stark evacuation orders from Rafah in May, but what's happened since is no more harrowing for the people of Gaza, who are waking up on every other day to evacuation orders, giving them very, very short time to move or face the consequences. This is women, children, the elderly, people who've moved 5, 10 times already, faced with an impossible dilemma. If they stay and they risk bombardment, further destruction, further death, and if they go, they don't know what's coming for them. There's either no space when they get there, they'll be in even more squalid conditions than those they left behind, or many, unfortunately and tragically and horrifically, have been killed en route. So what we have right now is a sea of people, every time these evacuation orders are issued, just grabbing for any small plot of land that is available on which they can put their meager belongings. And what we saw over the past 3 or 4 days, and it's continued what we've seen over August, was evacuation orders issued in parts of Gaza where the United Nations and many INGOs are operating. This was the so-called safe zone, which is being progressively shrunk. We're now in an area of Gaza that the only part of Gaza that hasn't been evacuated is about 11% of the total ground area. And we're seeing this progressively shrinking. So yes, there was a disruption overnight last night when those evacuation orders were issued, affecting UN, international and national staff. But I must insist that UNRWA's operations, the services that we have provided since October to a large majority of the population, are continuing to some degree in terms of basic healthcare, in terms of sanitation services, in terms of support and whatever protection we can provide to hundreds of thousands of people in and around our schools seeking shelter there. But yeah, indeed, the situation inside Gaza is becoming much more difficult to operate as we're squeezed. And the situation outside Gaza in terms of getting the aid in is also becoming more difficult. So we're very quickly running out of options.
Let me ask you about that latter point, getting the aid in. How much aid is currently getting into Gaza? And give us a comparison, because this has been going on for nearly 11 months. How does it compare to other moments during this tragedy?
I believe we're at the lowest point since November in terms of aid getting in. We're getting in an average of about 100 trucks a day, maybe some slightly over 100 trucks of humanitarian aid are getting in a day. That compares to about 300 a day before the Rafah operation started in May, and way below the 500 trucks that we have insisted are the requirements to meet the minimum humanitarian needs of the population.
OK, Sam, explain to us why the aid is not getting in, because it seems pretty simple. Israel is blocking it, isn't it?
I mean, nothing is simple about this operation. The very convoluted, very arbitrary checking procedures, restrictions on the items that we're able to bring in, lengthy bureaucratic procedures of checking the goods, of screening the goods, part of a system that's been in place since 2007 when the blockade was first introduced, but predates that many years as part of the longer term occupation. So difficult getting the aid and the supplies in, given scale, or to the border, given the scale of what we're looking at.
Sam Rose in Rafah from UNRWA, thank you very much. Let's discuss all this further with today's panel of guests. In Stockholm, Mads Gilbert is a doctor and activist who's worked in Gaza for many years. In Washington, D.C., Dave Harden is a former USAID mission director to the West Bank and Gaza. And in Gaza, Ghada Alhaddad is a communications officer for Oxfam. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us on today's Inside Story. Ghada, let me first ask you about the UN and the disruption to its delivery of aid and its operations. How central is the UN to aid delivery in the Gaza Strip?
Thank you so much for having me. The UN is very essential for delivering aid for the people in the Gaza Strip. And it is also, it helps most of the NGOs and INGOs in Gaza, including the organization that I work for, Oxfam. We rely on UN in many of our humanitarian operations on the ground. And the UN is also, its operation is also essential for delivering some of the human rights for the people in the Gaza Strip. I myself studied in UNRWA school all my life. I perfected my English in UNRWA school. So also like UNRWA helped in delivering many of the educational services, health services, and other services for the people in the Gaza Strip.
Mads, the reason we're seeing the current disruption of the UN operations are these evacuation orders. There have been 18 issued just in the month of August. Now, the stated purpose, according to Israel, is to protect people. But would you say these are actually having the opposite effect, exhausting, terrorising and endangering the population?
Absolutely. It's rubbish what the Israeli occupation army is claiming. And indeed, we should calibrate the language because these are not evacuation orders. When I, in the medical terms, speak about evacuation, we try to get some people from place A to B to protect them from an avalanche or from some flooding or anything. That's evacuation. This, what's happening now, is forceful, illegal displacement of large civilian populations, which is a form of collective punishment, has nothing to do with the security of these civilians. So I think the language by itself is unintentionally indicating that this is some goodwill, but it is not. It is chasing people from place to place, losing their access to water, losing their access to that little shelter they might have in a tent or in an apartment, and also, of course, scaring to death the children and the elders who don't understand why this chase is going on. I tell you what, animals in Europe have better protection during the Animal Welfare Protection Acts than people, humans in Gaza have under the Israeli regime. It is horrible, and we have been shouting about this for 10 months now, and it keeps going on.
Dave, you used to work for the US government's international aid department, the aid agency. What's your view on how Israel is operating here? These evacuation orders, a so-called safe zone that it repeatedly bombs, are they here obeying humanitarian norms or not?
I mean, I think it's clear that the Israelis are the occupying authority of Gaza and therefore have a duty of care for the entire population. And they are not meeting that standard. I think that that's fairly clear and without dispute. And so the basic needs of the vast majority of the population remain unmet, and it's Israel's responsibility to do better.
Ghada, let me talk to you about some of the specific problems that I think you and others are facing on the ground. Yes, there's a disruption for the evacuation orders, but I'm hearing, particularly from the World Food Programme's recent statements, that the state of the roads now, because of the damage from the battle that's gone on and the bombardment that's gone on for the best part of a year, are really seriously damaged, and it's going to become very hard to distribute aid, even if you were able to.
Actually, it's not about the roads. It's almost everywhere in Gaza is partially or completely destroyed. These days, I see more destruction, more debris than I ever seen in my life. And this make humanitarian operation on the ground very challenging. Most of our colleagues who work on humanitarian response worldwide keep telling us that working or humanitarian operations in Gaza is the most difficult and the most challenging one. And since the onset of the war, we've seen why it is the most complex one, because of the Israeli obstacles that are put and the Israeli relentless bombardment for civilian spaces in Gaza, which led to this amount of destruction. It doesn't impact solely the streets, but it does impact most of the critical infrastructure in Gaza, including water and sanitation infrastructure in Gaza. And this is all due to Israel relentless bombardment, Israel relentless airstrikes for almost everywhere in Gaza. Now, all the children can recognize very well what is the difference between F-16 airstrike and from a drone airstrike, from artillery shell. And this doesn't happen only. This does only happen in Gaza. It basically means the deprivation of people from the basic human rights, including food, including water, and other basic human rights. And it does, of course, impact the delivery and the distribution of aids among people who are in need.
Mads, let's just remind our viewers that you have worked in Gaza many, many times. You've been there in previous wars when Gaza was under bombardment. But, of course, those were periods that lasted weeks. We're getting close to a year now. You're in touch with people on the ground, doctors and surgeons on the ground. Tell us what they're telling you, and in particular, how these evacuation orders are affecting medical work. I'm told that the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital is the one that seems to have been impacted the most recently.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The last forced displacement order in Mid-South Gaza affected the territory where Al-Aqsa Hospital is located. And it led to a panic-like evacuation 24 hours ago. And I talked to my colleagues there today, and currently the hospital is almost empty. There are remaining about 100 patients. There are no surgeons, no emergency room doctors, no operating room functioning. Patients have been evacuated to Nasser Hospital, which was already filled up, and to one of the international field hospitals, which cannot do the type of surgery that is possible to do, like in Al-Aqsa Hospital. And 2 cases died there yesterday because of lack of access to life-saving emergency surgery. They are lacking padding, gauze, intravenous solutions, internal medicine services, ICU, cardiology, and so on. And we have to remember that this systematic undermining and direct attacks on not only the hospitals, but also the primary healthcare is rendering the population extremely vulnerable, not only to the wounds from the bombing, but to the diseases coming in the aftermath of the destruction of the water and food supply, because people without hygiene possibilities and who are malnourished will be, as we know, very, very exposed to infectious diseases, which is one of the main medical problems in Gaza today. Jaundice, hepatitis, and now we had the first case of polio with an 11-month-old Palestinian boy called Abdul Rahman, and he's contracted polio in Deir, Balah, one of the shelters. So we are seeing all textbook consequences of exactly this situation: lack of water, lack of food, lack of medical system. The difference from a natural disaster is that all of these elements are man-made on purpose by the Israeli occupation forces and can be reversed in 24 hours once Gaza is opened and once there is a forced ceasefire which will stop the bombing. You cannot start vaccine of the 1 million children who needs to be vaccinated now for polio when you have constant bombing. You cannot treat the wounds if the hospitals are empty of gauze. It's also so intrinsically sadistic the way that the healthcare system is being emptied of resources, emptied of people. And as it was said, this is the duty of the occupation force, of the Israeli government. They are actually responsible for the security and the health and the education of the occupied people. So how can this be going on almost a year on after October 2023? I don't understand it. I understand this is a shame to our humanity, because it affects, by and large, the civilian population, the children, the lactating women, the elders, and the sick people. And when we see the numbers of 40,000 killed, that's only the tip of the iceberg. You can multiply that by a factor of 3, 120,000 probably killed, and then you can multiply by a factor of maybe 10 to get the number of people with diseases and curable diseases who die because of lack of food, water, sanitation, and medical supplies. It's all very systematic, signed off by the Israeli occupation army and Netanyahu himself.
Dave, that case of polio, the first one in more than 25 years, there is perhaps a little bit of good news in that UNICEF now say that they've secured the 1.2 million doses of a vaccine. But as Mads says, that's no good, is it, unless you have some sort of truce to vaccinate? And I'm told it's 640,000 children who are unvaccinated currently.
Yeah. Look, this war may never end. In many respects, it's just a continuation since 2007. If this war ends, there are only three ways, right? One, the Israelis get exhausted and give up. Two, there's an unconditional surrender by Hamas. Both of those scenarios seem very unlikely. Therefore, the only realistic way forward is a political solution, i.e. a ceasefire of some sort. And without that political settlement, we're never going to vaccinate those children for polio and everything else. We're never going to clean up the rubble. We're never going to get clean water. We're never going to get a quality of life. We're never going to end the cycle of grievances, actually on both sides, that perpetrate war and conflict for generations to come. The only solution is a political settlement.
And the country that perhaps has the most leverage is the United States, where Dave is. The US, what would you say about the US's assistance in terms of humanitarian assistance? Because there were airdrops and then there was this pier that the US set up. Did that achieve anything at all?
One of the most important things that we keep asking for at Oxfam is, number one, a permanent full ceasefire, and number two, stop arming and sending arms and weapons to Israel. And this is not only the ask of Oxfam, but it is also the ask of many Palestinians on the ground, because we see what these weapons, what these arms are doing to us. They bomb us. You know, this, in a nutshell, they like flattened all Gaza. Like, we've seen what is the impact of trading arms with Israel. We've seen the negative consequences of this. It kills people. Many of our colleagues, many of our friends, everyone in Gaza has lost either a relative, a friend, a colleague due to this war. And it weighs heavily on us, psychologically speaking. I mean, everybody is traumatized with this thing. That's why it's important for all the international community, for all the states, including the United States, to stop arming and sending weapons to Israel. And the second thing is the full access to Gaza in order to facilitate more aids into Gaza. And this happens through the most efficient way, and we've seen what is the most efficient way. It is the land crossing that we already have. So in order to have more aids delivered to the people in need, in order to stop starving people, we can help them by sending and help the delivery of more aids, whether food, whether water, whether sanitation units to the people in need in Gaza.
OK, let me bring in Dave now. As you heard Ghada say there, the way to get aid in is by land, and yet the US pursued these airdrops. It pursued this pier. I looked up the details on your former agency's website of that operation. They say they brought in nearly £20 million of aid. I don't know why they weren't using tons. I suppose because it made it sound bigger. But we calculated that. That's about 660 trucks worth. That's what used to come into Gaza in a day. This was just a PR gimmick, wasn't it? And it makes the US look dreadful.
So, in general, I would agree the airdrops were humanitarian theater. The pier, which was an absolute failure, I actually supported that in the beginning because I wanted to create some facts on the ground in favor of the Gazans, where basic commodities, where there would be a precedent of basic commodities coming in through seaports. That doesn't relieve the international community, the Israelis, the U.S., of getting aid in through the land crossings. But the idea of a pier, while it didn't work in this instance, is something that I think a future Gaza does need. But in general, what you've seen is humanitarian theater.
Mads, your view on this? I mean, if the US wanted, it could get hundreds of trucks in a day, couldn't it? It has the leverage if it wants to use it, but it also could get a ceasefire, which it seems Prime Minister Netanyahu is the main obstacle to.
Well, the US could have stopped this in one day. If the US decided, if President Biden and Mr. Blinken decided, they could have stopped the shipment of arms, of bombs, and of money to Israel, and it would stop immediately. They would have to comply with the ceasefire negotiations and the recommended treaty for ceasefire recommended by the US and accepted by the Palestinians. So it's all, I agree, it's a theater. And the US has not been doing anything to promote ceasefire. On the contrary, they have been promoting bombing and more humanitarian misery, because Rafah could have been opened if and when the US had put heart to heart on Netanyahu and told him that if you don't open Rafah, there will be no more US support. And we mentioned the number of trucks. I have the last report here from the UNRWA, which I recommend to all the viewers. It comes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And it sums up that through August, the average daily number of trucks coming into Gaza has been 85 per day. Used to be 500 in peacetime to sustain the life in Gaza for the 2.2 million people. Now, if you reduce the supply from 500 to 85, even a child would understand that the people inside would not get enough. And you add on that the bombing, the destruction of water wells, the lack of sewage system, and all these other horror scenes. This is a deliberate, systematic starvation and killing. It is the theater of death that is being exposed to us. And the US are massively complicit. I think, for one...
Let me bring in Ghada at the end, because she's there on the ground in Gaza for us. Very briefly, Ghada, we've talked about all of the issues. Let me ask you what it's like for you, and how frightened are you going about your work, trying to help other people, but in a position where you could be targeted any moment?
Once you get this forced displacement order, you start to pack up everything as quickly as possible because you want to move. Because if you don't move as quickly as possible, you might be killed so easily. And you just run in the street. I was running last Friday in the street, not knowing where to go. And this scenario doesn't happen only to me. It happened to every single Palestinian in Gaza. We keep asking ourselves, where should we go? I mean, every now and then we get a new forced displacement order. We pack everything. We sometimes leave some stuff in the street because they are heavy, and we have to move as quickly as possible. There is no transportation. There is means. There is no vehicles because of the lack of fuel here, because of Israel constraint also on the entry of fuel in Gaza. We don't know where to go. We have no shelters. Most of the places are either partially destroyed or completely destroyed, or they are in a red zone, or Israel is designating them to be a conflict zone, so we cannot access them. It is really horrible and horrific that every day in the morning you just wake up and you need to work, you need to help other people who are in dire need, and at the same time you are afraid of your safety. And everybody has this kind of dilemma. Are we going to make it till tomorrow? Are we going to make it till the next day?
Ghada, thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests today, Dave Harden, Mads Gilbert and Ghada Alhaddad. Al Jazeera continues its coverage of the war on Gaza around the clock, with our teams reporting on the ground and full analysis on aljazeera.com. What shall we discuss on the programme next time? We want to hear from you on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or please message us on X, where we are at AJ Inside Story. From me, James Bays, and the team here in Doha, please stay safe. I'll be back here very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.